She walked into the room with nothing but a backpack, a homemade diagram, and a warning that could stop a billion-dollar rocket. No one believed her, until it was almost too late. What did she know that SpaceX's top engineers didn't? And why did Elon Musk risk everything to listen? Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers soon. Your support is the motivation that drives us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. It was nearly midnight at the SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. Most of the lights in the building had already gone dark, except for one, the CEO's office, where Elon Musk sat hunched over a series of launch schematics, a cold cup of coffee at his side. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the tinted windows, but inside, it was quiet, focused, almost too quiet. Then came the buzz. A sharp alert blinked across the corner of his screen, followed by a curt voice on the intercom. "Mr. Musk, there's someone at the front gate." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's almost midnight. Who is it?" "She's a kid, sir. Says it's urgent. Says the Falcon Ultra will explode if we launch it Thursday." Elon blinked. "A prank?" he muttered. "No, sir. She's here in person. Security says she's alone. No ID, just a backpack, some papers, and a laptop." Elon hesitated. He was no stranger to bold, strange intrusions, from fans to protesters. He'd seen them all, but a child? This was new. He tapped his fingers on the desk, then finally said, "Let her in." 5 minutes, no more. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened and she walked in. Barely 4 feet tall, messy brown hair tucked behind her ears, wearing a thrift store windbreaker too big for her frame. In one arm, she clutched a rolled-up sheet of graph paper, and in the other, a battered silver laptop that had seen better decades. "Name?" Elon asked, glancing at her, amused but guarded. "Leah," she said plainly. "I sent you 3 emails in December. You didn't read them." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You broke into one of the most secure buildings in California to tell me I missed an email?" Leah didn't flinch. She stepped forward, unfurling her paper across his desk. It was a hand-drawn schematic, shaky lines but precise annotations, layered over what looked like an old public release of the Falcon Ultra engine layout. "There's a feedback loop issue with your second-stage fuel compression. It creates a thermal choke at high altitude, especially if you launch in Thursday's conditions. Wind shear will amplify it. The chamber will overheat." Elon looked down, blinking once. That's a bold statement, coming from someone who hasn't hit high school. "I'm 10, and I'm not wrong." He couldn't help it, he chuckled. "Do you know how many brilliant adults have reviewed this design?" "Yes," Leah said. "That's why none of them caught it. They're used to looking at success metrics, not edge cases. I ran it through a different simulator. One I wrote myself." Elon raised an eyebrow. "On what?" She held up the scratched laptop. "I had to run it in segments," she admitted, "because it overheats after 10 minutes. But it's enough." He scanned the paper again. There was something about her tone, not arrogant, not desperate, just certain. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Assuming I humor this, what's your solution?" She pointed to a notation in the corner. "3 options," she replied. 2 involve minor adjustments to the injector ratios. The third is more expensive, thermal shielding realignment, but it gives you the best margin." Elon narrowed his eyes. "You're saying the Falcon Ultra, a $1.2 billion launch vehicle, could be taken down by a fuel miscalculation that my best engineers missed?" Leah didn't blink. "I'm saying if you launch Thursday, you're gambling with lives." There was silence between them, the room suddenly heavier. Finally, Elon stood up, motioning toward the door. "Time's up. I appreciate the concern, but this isn't how we do things." Leah started to turn, then stopped. 3 months ago, she said quietly, "I emailed your office. The subject line was, 'Critical risk in second-stage compression model.' Your assistant replied, 'We do not accept unsolicited technical suggestions from the public.'" She turned back to him, her eyes steady. "You were copied on that email." Elon's expression shifted, just slightly. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Outside, the wind tapped again on the window. Softer this time, like it was listening in. Elon sat alone after Leah left. The schematics still spread across his desk. He stared at them for a moment longer, then reached for his laptop. He typed quickly, pulling up the internal email logs. If she had emailed him 3 months ago, it would be there, somewhere. He searched the phrase she mentioned, critical risk in second stage compression model. The results came back fast. And there it was, a message from an unfamiliar address, marked as potential spam. No subject line in all caps. No links. No images. Just plain text and a few rough PDF attachments. The sender's name, Leah M. The time stamp, December 12th, 2:11 a.m. Elon opened the email. It was eerily similar to what she had just presented, same diagnostic notes. Same diagrams. Even the same concern about the launch conditions on a Thursday. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath through his nose. He hadn't ignored her intentionally. The system had, but that didn't matter now. He picked up his phone and called one person who could give him a second opinion. 15 minutes later, Randall Kramer, the lead propulsion engineer, stepped into the room, tall, silver-haired, with sharp eyes and a constant air of irritation. Kramer looked like a man who hadn't been questioned in a long time. "You said it was urgent," Kramer said, folding his arms as he approached the desk. His gaze fell on the hand-drawn schematics. "What am I looking at?" "A potential risk in the Falcon Ultra's second-stage fuel compression," Elon replied. "She says we missed something." "She?" Kramer's eyebrow lifted. Elon didn't answer that. Instead, he pointed at the highlighted section. "Take a look." Kramer grumbled but leaned in, scanning the notes. At first, he looked amused, then confused, then quiet. He didn't say anything for a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Where did this come from?" "A 10-year-old girl," Elon said, without flinching. Kramer straightened up, and just like that, the amusement returned to his face, this time with a touch of scorn. "You're seriously entertaining this?" he asked, his tone sharp. "We have a scheduled launch in 72 hours. The media's already hyping it up. Investors are flying in, and you're considering delaying the whole thing because some kid walks in with crayon diagrams?" "She's not wrong," Elon said, quietly. Kramer's jaw tensed. "We've run hundreds of simulations, thousands of hours of review. We don't take walk-ins off the street." "She sent an email 3 months ago," Elon said, turning his screen toward him. "It never got past the spam filter. But she caught something we didn't." Kramer waved it off. "This is reckless. We're going to risk our reputation, our partnerships, all for a wild theory from a child?" Before Elon could reply, another voice cut in, softer, uncertain. "I think she might be right." They both turned. It was Matteo, a young engineer who had just joined the team last fall. He stepped into the room cautiously, holding his ID badge in one hand. "I've run into anomalies in the modeling outputs too," Matteo said, "but I didn't think it was enough to raise alarms. Seeing her notes, it lines up." Kramer shot him a cold glare. "You don't have the authority to speak on this." Matteo hesitated. "I know, I just thought." "You thought wrong," Kramer snapped. "Go back to your station." Elon's voice was steady. "He stays." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Elon, don't do this. You're putting the entire company's credibility at risk over a guess. We've come too far to let a girl with a sketchpad dictate the mission." Leah, who had quietly re-entered the room under Elon's nod, stepped forward again. Her voice was calm. "There are 3 ways to fix it," she said. "You can adjust the injector ratios by 0.4%, reroute the thermal exhaust, or add a buffer layer to the shielding. None of it delays the launch more than a week." Kramer didn't even look at her. "This is absurd." But Elon looked directly at Leah, then back at the schematics. "I made the mistake of not listening the first time," he said. "I'm not making it again." He turned to the intercom. "Put all launch prep on hold. Call a full engineering review meeting. Effective immediately." Kramer stared at him like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're going to regret this," he said coldly. "You're putting a child's word over decades of experience." Elon didn't respond. He just kept looking at the screen, at the girl who refused to back down, and at the blueprint that might have saved them all. Kramer turned and left the room without another word. But his parting comment hung in the air. You'll answer to the world when this blows up in your face. Elon didn't say it aloud. But in that moment, he understood something deep down. If Leah was right, and he had a growing sense that she was, then what he was risking wasn't failure. It was trust, and he'd already ignored her once. The air inside the command conference room felt different that morning. It wasn't just the cold metal walls or the hum of machines in the distance, it was the quiet tension. The kind that built when people weren't sure if they were about to witness history or a career-ending mistake. Elon stood at the head of the long table, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Around him, the lead engineers of SpaceX filled every seat, some still clutching coffee cups, others silently flipping through the notes he'd handed out. On the screen behind him were detailed schematics. The title clear as day, Falcon Ultra. Stage 2 Fuel Cooling System, Risk Assessment Proposal. We're not here to speculate. Elon began, his voice calm but firm. We're here to look at a potential flaw. One that didn't come from our system. The murmurs started. A few heads turned. Some eyebrows rose. Before anyone could ask, the door opened again. Randall Kramer stepped in. The technical director of SpaceX wasn't a man who liked being questioned, much less summoned. His reputation was built on decades of precise engineering, razor-sharp authority, and a refusal to entertain anything that smelled like weakness. And this smelled like a circus. Let me get this straight, Kramer said, not waiting to be introduced. We're pausing a multi-billion-dollar launch schedule to investigate a theory sent in by a child? He walked slowly to the table, hands behind his back. This isn't just reckless, it's dangerous. It sets a precedent that anyone with a keyboard can claim to know more than teams of qualified engineers. Elon didn't flinch. If she's right, this isn't about precedent, it's about safety. And if she's wrong? Kramer countered. You've delayed a launch that was already overcommitted, shaken investor confidence, and handed our critics exactly what they've been waiting for. The door opened again. Leah stepped in, holding her laptop and a binder so full of handwritten notes it looked like it could burst at the seams. She stood beside Elon, small and calm. You wanted to hear it straight, Elon said. Here she is. Kramer smirked but waved his hand. Go ahead, Miss Leah Martin, she replied. Of course, he said, with mock graciousness. Please, teach us how to do our jobs. She didn't take the bait. Leah walked to the screen and began explaining the fuel cooling inconsistency she'd identified. She pointed to a specific data point that had been auto-adjusted by their simulation software, an adjustment. She argued that masked a critical failure under real-world conditions. Kramer interrupted halfway through. So, Leah, did you learn all this from TikTok? Or is there a YouTube playlist we should be watching? A few quiet chuckles rose around the room. Not from amusement, but discomfort. Leah didn't laugh. She kept going, showing charts she'd run through open-source modeling tools, backed by public datasets from previous launches. When she finished, there was silence. For a moment, Cameron, the same junior engineer who'd tried to speak up earlier, opened his mouth, but Kramer turned and gave him a single, sharp look. Cameron stopped, eyes down. Then Kramer stepped forward. Okay, enough games. Let's test it. Run her numbers through our system, he said. Let's see if her fairy tale holds up. No one moved. Elon turned to the team. Run the simulation, now. Within minutes, the projection appeared on the screen. Graphs flickered. Data fed into the modeling software. Visual patterns swirled and settled. Then, bold red warning symbols flashed across the screen. Failure likelihood, 68%. A few people sucked in their breath. One or two whispered. Elon didn't speak. He just looked around the room. Kramer stood with his arms still crossed. Software isn't gospel, he said, as if the data had insulted him personally. Simulations carry error margins. You all know that. He walked to the front of the room, addressing the engineers. Listen to me. I've seen hundreds of launches. I've seen real flaws. This is noise. We fixate on it. We lose momentum. You think the world cares about your simulations? They care about results. He turned back to Elon. I'll take responsibility. If this rocket goes up and anything happens, blame me. But don't tear down months of work because a little girl made you feel guilty. There it was. The line that hung in the air like a smoke trail. Kramer looked around the room. then raised his hand. Let's settle it. Vote. He scanned the engineers, one by one. If you trust Leah Martin, raise your hand. If you trust real science, stay seated. We don't have time for middle ground. Not the senior engineers, not the interns, not even Cameron. Then, slowly, a hand rose. It wasn't Leah's. It was Elon's. He raised his hand, calm, deliberate, as if the weight of the decision didn't shake him in the slightest. He didn't look at anyone, just stared at the red warning lights still glowing on the screen. And in that silence, you could hear it, the sound of a room torn between truth and fear. Later that day, the hum of the headquarters shifted. Not louder, not quieter, just different. Like the air held something it hadn't before. Behind closed doors, whispers ran faster than servers. In a quiet corner of the executive floor, Kramer stood with arms folded, looking over the shoulder of a communications manager. His voice was low, but firm. Draft the statement now. Say the Falcon Ultra meets or exceeds all international safety standards. Mention the latest test logs. Keep it technical. Don't mention the girl. The manager hesitated, eyes flicking up from the screen. And the anomaly reports from this morning? Noise, Kramer said. We're not building paranoia into our launch. In another part of the building, Mark Evans, a mid-level engineer, lingered in the hallway just outside. He hadn't meant to hear it, but now he couldn't unhear it either. Mark had been there 2 years ago when Kramer overrode an engine cooling test to meet a deadline. No one talked about it, but they all remembered. He walked away slowly, his mind racing. Meanwhile, Elon sat quietly in his office, eyes fixed on a single line of code on his screen, though he hadn't read it in minutes. A soft knock at the door. Come in, he said. Leah stepped in, notebook in one hand, laptop hugged close to her chest. Her feet barely made a sound on the polished floor. She looked hesitant but not afraid. I need to ask you something, Elon said, gesturing to the chair across from him. You said you emailed us 12 times? She nodded, then carefully pulled a folded printout from her pocket, crumpled, smudged, but still readable. It started 5 months ago. I noticed the first inconsistency in the simulation models on the public portal. I thought maybe I was wrong, so I re-ran it on a Raspberry Pi. Then again, and again. Her voice was steady, but there was a tired edge to it, like someone who'd already learned not to expect to be believed. I wrote the tech team. I used my school email. Then my uncle's. No reply. One email bounced back with a label, flagged for technology harassment. She looked up. I even tried to attend the Kids in STEM showcase. I got all the way to the front gate, but the guard wouldn't let me in. Said I needed an adult. Elon leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him. I understand, he started, then stopped. No, I don't, not fully, but I should have. Leah didn't gloat. She didn't even look satisfied. She simply said, it's not about me. It's about the people you're sending into space. They need to come back. Outside the room, another storm was brewing. In conference room B, Kramer had assembled a quiet meeting with members of the board and senior staff. The lights were low, the air still. I respect Elon, he began. He built this company, but we all see what's happening. He's being emotionally manipulated by an outsider. A child. Murmurs rippled. We've worked for years to earn public trust. One bad launch, or one bad rumor, and we're finished. I've held this together through 7 successful missions. We can't let personal sentiment guide our protocol. Then he turned toward a man seated halfway down the table. Darren, he said. Darren Claymore, head of international partnerships, nodded once. Quiet, sharp, and usually neutral. Darren didn't speak often unless it mattered. If Elon won't reverse this, Kramer continued, we need to consider a temporary reassignment of executive decision-making, at least until the Falcon Ultra clears orbit. Darren didn't respond, but he didn't protest, either. Later that evening, back in Elon's office, a sealed envelope was delivered by hand. He opened it and read, To Elon Musk, from Randall Kramer, Director of Engineering. Subject: Immediate action required. This is a formal request to nullify all launch decisions influenced by non-credentialed sources, including minors. Continuing to allow this interference poses direct threats to the integrity of national aerospace objectives. If you proceed further, I will be forced to disclose your decision to the Oversight Committee and the public, including your allowance of a minor's involvement in national infrastructure planning. Respectfully, R. Kramer. Elon read the letter twice. Then a third time. Outside the window, the city's lights flickered like they always did. But tonight, something about them felt colder. The letter from Kramer sat unopened on Elon's desk for most of the morning. He had read it the night before, but something in him refused to give it weight. Instead of responding, he quietly assembled a small, trusted group of engineers, bypassing official channels. No loud announcements, no email trails, just a few people he knew wouldn't flinch when asked to rethink everything. Run the numbers again, he told them, handing over Leah's notes. Start from scratch. Assume she's right. One of them was Daniel Cho, a junior propulsion analyst with just under 2 years at SpaceX. He had been the one to lower his hand halfway through Kramer's vote, then pull it back down before anyone saw. But he had seen the simulation glitch before. He hadn't said a word. Until now. That afternoon, Daniel found Leah in a quiet corner near the employee lounge, sitting cross-legged on the floor, tinkering with a 3D model on her battered laptop. He approached carefully, holding out a single printed page. I reran the simulations, he said softly, twice. Once with your adjustment, once with the default config. Leah looked up slowly, her eyes guarded. The error's real, Daniel added. It's not just theory, it's baked into the model's assumptions about micropressure stabilization. You weren't just right, you saw something no one else even questioned. Leah took the sheet, scanned it, and exhaled sharply. I have another fix, she said, one that doesn't delay the launch. We can reinforce the coolant manifold with an extra thermal sleeve, and fine-tune the micropressure valve in stage 2. It's small, we wouldn't need to touch the launch sequence. Daniel blinked. That's it? She nodded. That's it. While they spoke, Kramer moved faster. The morning's edition of TechCore Weekly ran a headline that spread like wildfire across social media. Musk takes advice from 10-year-old? Source says, SpaceX now runs on crayons. The article quoted an anonymous insider, claiming that Musk had jeopardized years of aerospace credibility by listening to a self-proclaimed child genius. No names, no evidence, but it didn't matter. Comment sections exploded. Some people mocked the story outright. This is either genius or madness. One tweet read, already with 100,000 likes. Others were less kind. Child influencer destroys billion-dollar rocket. Thanks, Elon. A storm of memes followed. One showed a cartoon of Elon handing over a rocket launch button to a little girl in a tutu. Another joked about training toddlers to handle nuclear codes next. Inside SpaceX, the divide was widening. A few staffers approached Elon in private, offering quiet words of support. But the majority kept their heads down, aligning with Kramer, who now controlled most of the department heads. Even those who believed Leah had something valuable to say were scared of being labeled, of being next in line to be mocked. The ridicule found its way to Leah, as it always does in the internet age. Her name hadn't been released, but that didn't stop people from calling her Gadget Girl or Elon's junior consultant. A few industry bloggers labeled her SpaceX's PR stunt, implying this was some elaborate attempt to make the company seem more inclusive. Late that night, in Elon's office, Leah sat with her knees tucked into her chest, laptop closed beside her. I don't know anymore, she said, voice barely above a whisper. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm making all this worse because I just want to matter? Elon didn't respond right away. He sat beside her, staring at the floor for a long moment. When I started SpaceX, he said, every expert told me I was a fool. They told me rockets were for governments, not startups, that I'd be lucky to make one launch. He looked over at her. We did fail, a lot, but the one thing I swore never to do was ignore a real problem. Just because it came from the wrong mouth. Leah didn't say anything. Elon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. If we're wrong, then we're wrong. But if we ignore what's right in front of us, because it came from a child, or it was inconvenient, or it embarrassed us, we don't deserve to build anything that flies. Leah looked at him, eyes glassy, but something steady forming behind them again. Outside, The sky above SpaceX hung heavy with stars. The boardroom at SpaceX was nothing like the innovation labs where ideas soared and mistakes were part of the journey. No, this room was different. It was all polished glass, high-backed leather chairs, and silence heavy enough to crush a man's voice. Kramer stood at the head of the table, calm, confident, and utterly in control. "I am formally requesting," he said, "that Elon Musk be removed from making any further technical decisions regarding Falcon Ultra. His recent behavior demonstrates a pattern of erratic judgment and emotional compromise." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word was calculated, like a chess piece moved with precision. Several board members exchanged glances. A few nodded, others stayed still, but no one laughed it off. No one dismissed him. A vote was scheduled for 48 hours later. If passed, Elon would lose all authority over Falcon Ultra, the project he had shepherded from sketchpad to steel. That night, the mood inside the engineering bay was very different. Dimmed lights, scattered energy drinks, and tired eyes stared into monitors as Elon, Leah, Daniel, and Maria worked in silence. The four of them combed through simulations, diagrams, and logs, trying to find the one thing that could pierce through the armor Kramer had built around himself. "Wait," Maria said, pulling up a flagged internal report. 2 months ago, there was a thermal instability review filed by the Stage 2 Dynamics team. It was marked, non-actionable, by. She paused. By Kramer. Daniel finished, his voice tight. The report clearly identified the same instability Leah had uncovered, minor at first glance, but potentially catastrophic under high-frequency stress conditions. The data was clean. The math checked out, but Kramer had signed off on the review with a single line, "Not relevant to current launch path." "Can we use this?" Daniel asked. Elon leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "Not alone. It'll look like a judgment call," he said, "unless we prove he buried it deliberately. They'll say it was a timing issue." Silence followed, until Maria glanced up. "There is someone," she said. "Rick Delgado. He was the safety audit lead on Falcon Ultra before he left." Elon looked up. "Why'd he leave?" "Clashed with Kramer," she said, hard. "He walked out before the Q2 review." Within an hour, Rick, tired, wary, and clearly reluctant, was seated across from them. His hands fidgeted with a metal pen, something he kept flipping between his fingers without realizing it. "We told him," Rick said. "My team flagged the instability 3 separate times. But he said it was a branding issue to have more delays. He told us to fold the findings into the long-term R&D files." Elon didn't flinch. "Do you have anything that proves he said that?" Rick hesitated, then nodded. "Barely. I recorded our final technical briefing," he said. "Didn't plan to, but I'd seen him twist too many stories. It's just audio, but it's clear." Leah, sitting quietly near the corner, finally looked up. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" she asked. Not accusing, just tired. "I signed an NDA," Rick said. "If I release it, I'll get sued, maybe blacklisted. I've got a family." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small drive, placing it on the table like it burned to the touch. "I don't know what's right anymore," he said, standing. "But if you're going to fight, you'll need more than good intentions." After he left, the room was still for a long moment. Elon turned to Leah. "Want to hear it?" She nodded slowly. He pressed play. At first, it was just background noise. A few rustles. Then Kramer's voice, cold and deliberate. "I don't care who flagged it. Falcon Ultra launches on schedule. If it blows, we get a lesson. If we delay, we lose trust. And I don't lose trust. Ever." Leah sat back, her face pale. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew." Elon looked at the screen, then out the window, where the lights of Los Angeles flickered like silent questions. They finally had something that could shift the boardroom. But whether the world would listen, that was another battle entirely. The office was dim, the hum of electronics the only sound as Elon leaned back in his chair. Eyes closed. The voice on the recording still echoed in his mind, Kramer's cold confidence. His complete disregard for consequence. It wasn't just arrogance, it was conviction fueled by unchecked power. He sat in silence, the file drive resting beside him like a loaded weapon. Releasing it would shake the foundation of everything he'd built. Shareholders would panic. Partners would question. SpaceX could lose more than trust, it could lose its future. Rick Delgado, the former engineer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat across the room. I'm not looking for revenge, he said quietly. I just didn't want to be part of it. Elon didn't answer. Leah, seated cross-legged on the floor beside her tattered backpack, stared out the window. Her voice was soft, but every word landed heavy. If you stay quiet, people like me, kids who care, who try, we'll never be heard. Ever. Not here. Not anywhere. Her voice cracked, not with fear but with truth. Rick looked away. Elon didn't. Outside, the world moved forward, but inside that room, time stalled. Meanwhile, in a conference room dressed in blue banners and streaming lights, Kramer stood behind a podium. A smile played on his lips like a mask well practiced. Falcon Ultra is fully cleared for launch, he said. All systems have been thoroughly reviewed by our top engineers. Any rumors suggesting otherwise are unfounded and, frankly, irresponsible. Behind him, a screen displayed animations of the rocket soaring smoothly into the sky. No turbulence, no hesitation. He didn't mention Leah, he didn't need to, but the internet wasn't as easily controlled. By evening, a hashtag began trending, #StopTheLaunch. Posts popped up everywhere, questioning SpaceX's silence, demanding transparency. Tech blogs picked it up. A few small journalists tried to chase the story. But Kramer's team was fast, coordinated. Within hours, stories were buried under a flood of counter-narratives, unverified sources. Teen hoax, no engineering credentials. A wave of influencers suddenly praising the Falcon Ultra flooded feeds. Inside SpaceX, lines were being drawn. And then, from the shadows of silence, someone else stepped forward. Ethan Morales, a systems analyst who had long stayed out of the drama, knocked gently on Elon's door. I think you'll want to see this, he said. He placed a printed email on Elon's desk. The subject line was short. The content, chilling. From k.kramer@spacex.com. 2. Engineering Review Group. Subject: delay all internal flags. Block feedback from Inspection Division. Push safety reports to 1 week post-launch. No exceptions. Elon read it twice. You kept this? He asked. I archived it, Ethan said. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Elon exhaled, deep and steady. Between the recording, the email, and the simulation, the truth had formed now. It had teeth, but the board didn't see it that way. The next morning, in an urgent session, Elon laid it all out. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply presented facts. Some listened, some looked away, and one board member, an older man with a sharp tie and sharper eyes, finally said what everyone else was thinking. If you go public with this, SpaceX loses billions. Stocks will plummet. Partners will scatter. Is this really about safety? Or about a girl with a grudge? Elon paused. He looked at the board, then at the stack of evidence on the table, then back at the board again. It's not about her, he said. It's about who we are when no one's watching. That night, as silence reclaimed the corridors, Elon sat alone. He opened his encrypted messaging app and typed a name: Clara Temple. A journalist who had once exposed a corrupt defense contractor with nothing but a USB stick and a deadline. He uploaded the entire package, recordings, emails, memos, and paused before hitting send. Wait for my signal. That was all he wrote. Then he stepped out onto the balcony, the wind brushing against his shirt, and looked toward the Falcon Ultra launch site. It sat like a beast beneath floodlights, sleek and beautiful, but dangerous if misunderstood. It wasn't just metal and math. It was everything they chose to ignore or to face. The morning sun barely broke through the thick coastal fog, casting a gray haze over the SpaceX headquarters. Inside the executive boardroom, the atmosphere was far heavier. Chairs scraped softly against the polished floor. Papers rustled with nervous hands. And coffee sat untouched, cooling in half-sipped mugs. It wasn't just another meeting, it was a reckoning. Kramer stood at the end of the table, polished as always, his tie symmetrical, voice calm but sharpened like a scalpel. Let's be clear, he said, glancing around the room. This isn't about one engineer or one project lead. This is about the integrity of our mission. We cannot allow fear, emotion, or unverified claims to steer the most ambitious launch of our decade? Some heads nodded, others hesitated. He continued, "We must vote to temporarily reassign Mr. Musk from direct involvement in Falcon Ultra. This is not personal. This is procedural, for the safety of the company and the credibility of our work." Elon, seated across from him, said nothing at first, but when the chair of the board asked if he had anything to say before the vote, he rose quietly. "I do." He walked to the front, a slim drive in hand. Without preamble, he plugged it into the console and hit play. Kramer's voice filled the room. Unmistakable. "If it explodes, we learn something. But if we delay, we lose shareholder confidence. That's the real danger." Gasps echoed. He let the recording run a second time, then paused. The silence that followed was different, heavier, more loaded. He clicked again. A second screen lit up, an internal email. Dated 2 months earlier. Kramer's name stamped atop it. "Delay all risk-related feedback until post-launch. No exceptions." Elon turned to face the room, his voice quiet but firm. "Falcon Ultra isn't just a rocket. It's a symbol, and what we do now tells the world who we are when no one's watching." He took a breath, steady but slow. "We are not launching metal. We are launching trust. If it fails, not because of physics but because we ignored the truth, then we deserve what follows." Kramer leaned forward, lips pressed into a tight line. "That recording," he said, "could have been edited, manufactured. Nothing here is admissible. You're all being played by Theatrix." He turned slightly, glancing at the livestream camera now being operated by one of the press representatives in the back. "You think the court of public opinion won't question this?" Just then, the door opened. Leah stepped in. She looked small, almost swallowed by the size of the room. But she walked straight to the table. Her backpack dangled off one shoulder. Her steps quiet but confident. She placed a single rolled-up sheet of paper on the table. "I redrew the entire fuel flow system," she said. "This works. It cools the unstable zone without altering launch timing." She unrolled it. Even from across the table, several engineers leaned forward. The simplicity of the design stunned them. "I don't care if you never mention my name," she added. "I just don't want people to die because nobody listened." One board member blinked away what might have been emotion. Another cleared their throat but didn't speak. The livestream viewer count, displayed on a small screen to the side, jumped 20.000, 35.000, and climbing. The room shifted, not in noise, but in posture. People sat straighter, looked harder, rethought everything. Then a voice broke the standoff. Diane Reeves, Director of Global Strategy, a woman who had aligned with Kramer on nearly every vote until now, stood up slowly. "If we proceed, despite what's on that recording, despite the email, despite this child's courage, we're no longer engineers. We're enablers." Kramer's jaw tightened. "I will be filing an official request to suspend the launch," Diane said, "and if that request is denied, I will report this entire chain of suppression to the FAA and the International Spaceflight Safety Commission." Her words hung in the air like a dropped match. Elon didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just watched as a flicker of something unfamiliar crossed Kramer's face. Not anger, but fear. The next morning, the countdown clock was paused, literally, on every monitor across the SpaceX launch complex. Falcon Ultra's launch status was marked with a bold red banner, "Suspended 24 hours, safety review pending." Inside the walls of the company, tension thickened like fog. Conversations turned into whispers, glances into judgments. Outside, the world roared. The leak had spread fast. News outlets plastered screenshots of the email, ran clips of the audio recording, and replayed Leah's quiet, unshaking voice over and over. Her blueprint, hand-drawn and scanned in poor resolution, was now viral. Engineers from universities and private firms were uploading videos explaining why she might actually be right. Others were skeptical. Some called it child genius. Others, an elaborate PR stunt. Kramer didn't sit idle. By mid-afternoon, he launched a full-throated counterattack, backed by a panel of what he called independent aerospace analysts. They held their own media briefing, claiming that Leah's model was incomplete, that her adjustments, while creative, fell within acceptable margins of variance. They presented graphs, charts, credentials, and then one of them, a white-haired man in a pressed suit, leaned forward into the mic and said, "Mr. Musk has a history of media stunts. This is no different." The media split down the middle. Headlines read like battle flags. Teen genius saves SpaceX. Sat beside, tech CEO hijacks engineering for sympathy. Within SpaceX, the board fractured. Some directors demanded an emergency investigation. Others wanted to open a formal ethics inquiry. A few, silent until now, started to murmur about succession. Still, Elon stayed silent until he didn't. At 5 p.m., a live feed lit up across major networks. Elon Musk, dressed plainly, stood behind a simple podium. There was no flashy backdrop, just a black curtain and a line of floodlights casting sharp shadows behind him. He didn't begin with pleasantries. "I won't waste your time," he said. "There's been a lot of noise. So, let's get to the signal." He stepped back. Leah stepped forward. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her sleeves too long, cuffs slightly frayed. She clutched a rolled-up paper in one hand, a tablet in the other. She looked out at the lights, the silence, the blinking red cameras. Then she spoke. "If this thing explodes," she said, "I'll never forgive myself. Because I knew. But if you launch it anyway, knowing what we all know now, then I won't forgive any of you either." She unrolled her schematic. For the next 15 minutes, she walked through her findings. Slowly, clearly, each point backed by basic physics, logic, and observations pulled from publicly available telemetry and internal simulations. She wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to prevent a catastrophe. Halfway through, someone tried to cut the feed. But SpaceX's legal team had anticipated the move. Elon had cleared the broadcast through external platforms, mirrored to dozens of independent media sites. The feed stayed up. One question came from a viewer in New Mexico, another from a physicist in Denmark, a third from a retired NASA engineer in Florida. Each time, Leah answered, not perfectly, but honestly, and that was what mattered. By the time she finished, the hashtag let her speak had trended to #1 in over 20 countries. Kramer, watching from a private suite 3 floors up, stood rigid, arms crossed, lips pressed so tight they disappeared. The cameras turned back to Elon. "We've all made mistakes," he said, voice steadier than it had been in days. "The only question is what we do after we find out we made one." Then he stepped away from the podium, looked directly into the lens, and said, "Now the world knows, and we'll see who still wants to push that button." She stood still for a moment, letting the lights settle and the room grow quiet. Then, with both hands, she unrolled her drawing on the long table beside her, creased, taped in corners, covered in smudges. A child's paper, maybe, but it was laid out like blueprints to something bigger than rockets. "My name doesn't matter," she began, voice small but sharp. "What matters is what you see here." She pointed to the model's core structure, guiding her explanation with nothing more than a pencil and a quiet kind of certainty. Her words didn't float, they landed, one after the other, like pieces locking into place. No PowerPoint, no technical jargon designed to impress. Just straight logic, delivered with a raw clarity that cut through the noise like a beam of light in a smoke-filled room. She used household metaphors. She compared the fuel chamber's pressure imbalance to an overinflated balloon inside a freezer. She likened the insulation layer to a winter coat with a tear near the heart. "You might not feel it at first," she said, "but when the wind gets strong enough, that rip becomes everything." Viewers around the world stayed glued to their screens. Social media exploded. Engineers, real ones, from NASA, Boeing, universities, began posting real-time breakdowns, echoing her findings. "She's right," one veteran propulsion expert tweeted. "And she spotted it without simulation software. Unbelievable." "She didn't guess," wrote another. "She understood." And just as the applause began to build in digital waves, something else surfaced. A screenshot, an email, anonymous at first, then confirmed. It was a 3-month-old memo from Kramer, leaked to a public message board. In it, he had directed senior teams to dismiss low-priority thermal anomalies flagged during early stress testing, to avoid delays that could affect Q2 performance metrics. The language was clinical, But the intention was clear. He'd chosen silence, deliberately. When reporters pressed him later that day, Kramer scoffed. Fabricated, he said. All of it, a performance orchestrated by Elon Musk to shift attention away from his recent failures. That girl's just another pawn in his game. But it didn't stop there. Minutes after his denial, a man joined the livestream. Remote but very real. His name was Paul Grayson, former head of systems integrity at SpaceX. I received that email, Paul said calmly. I left the company because I refused to approve it, and I've kept that record in case someone ever tried to erase the truth. He held up a printed version of the memo. No blur, no editing. Back on stage, the girl looked down at her paper, then up at the millions watching. Her voice wavered once, but only once. I don't want the rocket to be cancelled, she said. I think it's beautiful. I just want it fixed. I want people to live. She paused, then added, I never wanted attention. I just wanted people to stop dismissing kids because of how small we look. Or how young we sound. Science isn't a privilege for grown-ups. It's not a members-only club. It's a way to protect each other. And we should all get to be part of that. The auditorium didn't erupt right away. First, there was silence. Heavy, thoughtful, breath-held silence. Then applause, growing like a wave breaking over the tension of the past weeks. People stood. Engineers stood. Board members stood. Kramer stayed seated. Elon turned to him. For a moment, he didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply said, that kid we ignored? She just saved us all. And for the first time in a long while, Kramer had no words. The day after the world watched a child dismantle a billion-dollar miscalculation with nothing but paper, pencil, and clarity, the boardroom at SpaceX became a war room. For 6 straight hours, the company's top decision-makers pored over documentation, recordings, and witness accounts. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The facts were louder than anything they could say. By late afternoon, a decision was reached. Kramer was suspended indefinitely, pending a full internal investigation into his suppression of safety reports and deliberate misrepresentation of engineering concerns. The press release was clear but restrained, corporate, careful, but the public already had its headline. Elon had stayed quiet during most of the deliberation, only nodding once the vote concluded. He didn't celebrate. He just stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out toward the launch complex as the sky began to darken. The reaction outside the walls of SpaceX was anything but restrained. Tech blogs exploded with praise. Aviation boards lit up with admiration. Mainstream media began calling her the youngest unofficial aerospace advisor in history. Offers flooded in, from universities, think tanks, documentary producers, but the girl declined them all. She agreed to speak only once, at a talk Elon hosted for a group of young engineers and students at the company's headquarters. No journalists, no cameras, just a circle of folding chairs in the design bay, surrounded by unfinished models and forgotten parts. Elon took the floor first. I used to think my greatest fear was a rocket exploding midair, he said, but this week made me realize, what scared me more was that I'd become someone who thought age defined intelligence. That silence was safer than doubt. The room didn't move, they all just listened. She didn't read from notes. She didn't rehearse. She told them about being turned away at the gate, about her emails going unanswered, about thinking maybe she was crazy. But mostly, she talked about science. Science isn't a prize, she said. It's not something grown-ups hand out when they think you're ready. It's a flashlight, and if you have it, you should use it, no matter how small your hands are. Some of the same engineers who'd dismissed her weeks earlier, like Thomas, who once muttered she didn't belong, stood up that day and apologized publicly. Others, like Megan from the structural team, offered to join the task force dedicated to redesigning the fuel routing system, based entirely on the model the girl had built. She didn't smile or rush to accept. I don't need an apology for me, she said quietly. I need you to take that apology and give it to the next kid who writes in with an idea. And the one after that. I needed to change something. Silence followed, not out of guilt, but because no one dared say anything that might reduce her words. After the event, Elon pulled her aside, his expression unreadable. I've never done this before, he said. But I'd like to name you an honorary advisor to SpaceX. She looked up at him for a long moment, then asked, "Are you going to listen to other people like me? Or is this just for show?" He didn't blink. "Starting today," he said, "it's not just you." She nodded, then walked away to rejoin the students, her people. The ones she hadn't forgotten. The ones who still believed that even small voices, when they speak the truth, can bend steel. 3 months passed quietly, but not without effort. Falcon Ultra was stripped down and rebuilt from the inside out. No cutting corners, no rushed signatures. Every bolt, every seal, every line of code was triple-checked, and not just by engineers in polished labs, but also by a new layer of scrutiny that hadn't existed before: open feedback from the public. Elon kept his word. He launched a public initiative called Minds Without Titles, inviting anyone, no matter their background or age, to submit ideas for improving aerospace safety and innovation. It wasn't just a marketing campaign. The portal was real, reviewed weekly by a committee of engineers, and even featured the tagline handwritten in crayon by the very girl who had helped change everything. "If it helps us not explode, we'll read it." As for Kramer, he never returned to SpaceX. Word spread that he was negotiating a quiet retirement, hoping to slip out the back door without further damage to his reputation. It wasn't a dramatic downfall. There was no courtroom, no press conference, just silence, and an inbox he no longer controlled. The girl was offered everything from scholarships to early university entry. She turned them all down. "I want to finish school with kids my age," she told a stunned board of education. "I still forget my locker combination sometimes. I'm not ready for anything else." Still, her story didn't fade. It found its way into textbooks and podcasts, youth forums and commencement speeches. Teachers used it to explain the power of dissent, of asking questions when it feels easier to stay quiet. Her name became synonymous not with genius, but with courage. On the morning of the relaunch, the air around Cape Canaveral was different. It wasn't tense. It wasn't flashy. No music, no fireworks, no sweeping narration about destiny. Just engineers, families, a quiet crowd that understood what was at stake. On the side of Falcon Ultra, just above the fuel tank access hatch, someone had taped a small drawing. Crude, colorful, a child's handwriting curved across the page in marker: "Safety first, truth second, ego last." It was a message, not just for the crew or the company, but for anyone who'd ever looked up and thought they were too small to make a difference. Elon stood next to her as the countdown began. No press swarming, no applause, just the two of them, watching the rocket they had saved through sleepless nights, impossible odds, and one stubborn truth no one wanted to hear. He glanced sideways. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" he asked softly. She didn't blink. "It's not about what I want to be," she said. "It's about making sure people like me always get to speak when they see something wrong." And then, liftoff. Falcon Ultra rose cleanly, carving a white arc across the sky. No fireball, no panic, just grace. The cameras didn't zoom in on the launch pad or the crowd. They followed the rocket, higher and higher, until it became a speck in the sky. A reminder that brilliance doesn't wear a uniform, carry a degree, or wait its turn, and that the sky, no matter how far it stretches, is never reserved for just a few. In the end, it wasn't just about a rocket or a launch. It was about listening, truly listening, even when the voice is small, young, or unexpected, because sometimes, the truth doesn't come from titles, degrees, or boardrooms. It comes from courage wrapped in innocence. What would have happened if no one had listened to her? And more importantly, how many voices just like hers are we still ignoring today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets so you won't miss the next story that challenges what we think we know. See you in the next one.